I am Dr. Murgo, Richard Murgo. I am the Dean for Social Sciences here at TCC. We've got a great set of panelists to talk about, is the United States in a constitutional crisis? And I was just ran by, I spoke with Dr. Dugan about this earlier, and we agreed that be you very conservative, be you very liberal, I think you can make the argument that perhaps we are in a constitutional crisis. And it might be a reasonable conversation and a place for us to start, and very, very timely right now. We've got, again, a great set of panelists. We've got Dr. Dugan, who's a professor of political science. We have Dr. Brian Kupfer, professor and chair for political science and criminal justice. We've got Stephen Powers, professor of political science. To throw some balance into this, we've got Dr. David Proctor, professor and department chair for history. And again, for even some better balance, we have Kaylor Walton-Neely, professor for criminal justice. So I think we're going to have a fairly evenly balanced discussion. Panelists, if I can ask you to do it, kind of open up with a statement and a little intro, about 3 or 4 minutes. That way we got some time for questions afterwards, if that's okay with y'all. Dr. Dugan, would you start us off?
Sure. I think that I just wanted to say that the Constitution is obviously a little over 7,000 words. And so we don't necessarily have a Constitution that lays everything out in detail, which allows for debate to take place, and it allows for change. But it also means that people can have different interpretations of the Constitution, and that's what we're really dealing with right now. People are very up in arms right now over the election. There's kind of a crisis. I would say both liberals and conservatives believe that there may be some shenanigans in the election and that we might have a constitutional crisis. So that's one of the major constitutional crises I think that we have in this country, is that there's a lot of talk of potentially people voting twice, obviously, as the president has instructed some of his people, particularly in North Carolina, to send in their ballots by mail, but then also to try and vote and check to see whether they voted at the actual poll place. And so that could cause a situation where there's a lot of chaos on November 3rd when the election takes place. And the other thing that has potentially to be chaotic is that there's a lot of people voting by mail, which means that we might not get the results the night of the election, which is kind of a tradition in the United States. But it's not always, hasn't always historically been the same, and maybe David Proctor might talk about some of those outliers. But the problem with not necessarily having a clear winner on the night of the election is that somebody might declare that they've won before they've counted the votes, which would really be a chaotic situation. And so it's up to people to be responsible citizens. Specifically, there's a lot of danger that Fox News or some of the other media might come out and say, this person is the winner based on the votes that have been counted so far. And so that certainly would create a situation where both sides might be able to declare themselves to be victorious. And that would be very bad for democracy because, and this is the last thing that I'll end it on, which is that a lot of countries have great constitutions with wonderful human rights. They just don't follow them. Or dictators will go in and change the constitutions on a continual basis. So just because you have wonderful rules in your society does not necessarily mean that you have a wonderful society. And that's one of the reasons why we're having this panel today, because we, we need to be vigilant about keeping our Constitution. I get a little bit, it's the best way to say this, religious when it comes to the Constitution. I mean, I just think it's the foundation of all of our society. That's the rules that we play by in our society, and we don't really value it because we don't know what the world would be like without it. So.
Thank you, Dr. Dugan. Dr. Kupfer.
Well, I agree with a lot of what he just said. I mean, I kind of look at it as what exactly is a crisis. To me, it's when things are not working as intended. And, you know, I look at, you know, just to go in a different direction, you know, I look at some of the structural things going back to the election. You know, is this going to be a situation, you know, there's a really plausible case to be made that Joe Biden and Donald Trump might not agree with the results or might declare themselves winners on election night without us knowing too, right? It could, I'm not saying that will happen, but it's very possible to me that both could actually do it, depending on what the dynamics are. You could also have a situation, and very well may, where Joe Biden wins the popular vote by close to 5-6 million votes and still loses the election. I mean, that is a real possibility. And so I go back to what was the intention. You know, I don't know if you can make a case that that's not what the Constitution is intended to do, in the sense that there's no reference that I'm aware of the popular vote in the Constitution. I've read the Federalist Papers. They didn't seem particularly concerned with it. But is that a good way to try to run a society when you're telling 6 or 7 potentially million people that even though the majority of the country doesn't want this person to be their representative, they're going to have to live with that result time and time again. Again, I'm not saying that that will happen, but it's very much on the table of realistic possibilities. So, you know, I think, you know, Dr. Dugan and I talk quite a bit, and I say this to him all the time, and he and I kind of repeat ourselves to each other sometimes. But, you know, I think we know that there's going to be an election on November 3rd. I think that's pretty apparent. You know, I don't think any reason why that won't happen. After that, it goes in a million directions. There's a lot of different potential things. I don't know what any of them are actually going to be. It's like the example I always give, it's like a spaghetti model tracking a hurricane. You know, they're saying if there's a hurricane off the coast of Africa, it's going to hit somewhere between the Yucatan and Maine. That doesn't really mean very much because that's like 7,000 miles, you know, between those two places. And I feel like, you know, there's so many possible outcomes. It's hard for me to speculate too much, because that becomes, I think, perhaps in of itself counterproductive. But I do think we need to constantly ask, what was the intention of the document? And, you know, there are definitely, you know, real possibilities where if there are a lot of mail-in votes and they look like they're probably going to favor the Democrats, because the Democrats seem to be requesting more mail-in ballots, at least at this juncture, than the Republicans are, that it could look like what some of the media are calling the red mirage, I believe is the term, where you have it looking like the Democrats lose on election night, and then as the votes start getting counted a little more, it looks like they win, and that Donald Trump could say that that's fraud. You know, but I think, you know, I'm reading just in between this that apparently the president said that there's, if I saw this correctly, there's virtually no way that he can lose without there being fraud. And that's a really dangerous place to be in, particularly when the polls are showing that the majority of the country would prefer somebody else to be president, if not by a small margin. So I could go on. I could also stop.
Thank you, Dr. Kupfer.
You're welcome.
Professor Powers.
In my opinion, in short answer to your question, I don't think there's a constitutional crisis. I think there's a social crisis. With, you know, the Electoral College notwithstanding, which I think is, you know, it's worth considering adjusting or changing the Electoral College and how we elect the president through the Constitution. But I think otherwise the document is fundamentally sound. You know, we all tend to think that the apocalypse is going to occur in our lifetime. And so we look at the crises and the events in our lifetime, and we think it's never been worse. And oh my God, the system's in crisis. All of this has happened before. There's been contested elections. The Constitution's guided us through a civil war, 2 world wars, a Great Depression. We came out on the other side. Okay. So I don't think the problems with the Constitution. I think it's with us as a people. Ted, you said it correctly. It's just words on a piece of paper unless we abide by and believe in it. And Brian, I agree with you too. I think both sides are posturing themselves to be able to say on election night or the day after the election that the election was stolen from them. And this is a social crisis, not a constitutional crisis. This is irresponsibility on the part of our leaders who are trying to finagle the democratic process to their favor. So I think it's more of a social than a legal crisis myself. And I could say more too, but I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you, Professor Powers. And I would encourage our attendees, use the Q&A and use chat if you have questions, and I'll start posing them to our panelists. But given that, Dr. Proctor, if you would have a few comments for the group.
Yeah, never give the floor to a historian, because we'll drone on for hours. But
that worried me. But please take it.
I promise not to do that. I would just, these are all great comments, so I won't belabor all that, and they're all very, very timely and relevant. What I would add to our introduction here is the importance of understanding the history of the Constitution, not just the convention itself and it coming out of the Revolution, but also all the 27 amendments and all the story that went along with that, because they're often tied into major events in American history. So I think what we need to think about, in addition to everything else, is who made the Constitution, how was it drawn up, what were the philosophies behind it, and you would certainly want to mention the European Enlightenment, the whole idea of rational government and consent of the governed, and all those guys. Jefferson was in Paris, but Washington and all the others, were very steeped in Enlightenment philosophy and the reading of John Locke and so on. So that's where they were coming from. And it was quite an advanced document for its time. Then, of course, but it was, it reflected all the problems of the colonies, and of course, most particularly slavery and the enslavement of African Americans, and it really, its failure to deal with that. There was momentum to end slavery because of the revolution in the northern states where there wasn't much slavery, but the southern plantation owners decided to dig in and hold on to it. And it was such a fundamental divide that the founders, some of them were slave owners, quite a few of them, but there were many who weren't, like Ben Franklin and so on. But they ended up having to paper that over, and then of course, it really didn't get settled till the Civil War. But of course, then after that, it's the issue of, well, you end slavery, but you have what is the status of freed slaves, of African Americans. And you get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to try to address that. But each amendment has a great story, and they're the best way. What I try to do in class is go at those amendments and show you the story behind them, and you can see the evolution of the Constitution. So I think what we want to do is be familiar with the American Revolution and the context of the Constitution, know the Enlightenment well, and what these guys were trying to achieve. But understand that we should, I believe we should keep the Constitution, but it definitely has to be a living document. There is a school of thought out there that wants to almost freeze it in amber. In fact, you had a political candidate in Alabama's Senate election a few years back, Doug Jones versus Roy Moore, and whether he was, quote, joking or not, Roy Moore said, well, we ought to get rid of all the amendments back to 10 and just keep the Bill of Rights. I'm sure that's hilariously funny, except that you're getting rid of the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery and so on. So you don't want to, you can't freeze it in amber. But on the other hand, I think given the divisions and polarization, I wouldn't dare want to try to do a constitutional convention today. we better keep what we have that actually works, as opposed to blow ourselves up, because I don't think you could get a consensus on that. So we need to understand the process of evolution with the Constitution, how the amendments have changed it. We need to have a good historical grasp of that, because I don't think we ever want to get rid of the Constitution at all. I think that would be just a disaster and a huge crisis. But I think it is, just like it's already been amended 27 times, it's going to have future amendments. The big ones that I see, and I'll wrap up, are the Electoral College. I think that one is headed for major stress. It's just 200 and, let me get the official number, 233 years, Rick, if I'm right here. It's just, the society and the country is so much bigger and has evolved so much beyond that, that one's gonna have to be rethought. That's my prediction. But you've got one side that's clinging to it because it's benefiting them right now. And so I don't know how to deal with that, but that's the one, that one needs to be fixed for sure, for the stabilization of the Republic. So my point is, study the history of the Constitution, study the stories behind the amendments, definitely study the election of 1876. That one's getting very relevant, because you had the turmoil of Reconstruction, and the Ku Klux Klan was night riding, and there were federal troops in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. You sent competing slates of electors. Militias were starting to drill in the southern capitals. And basically Congress came up with the Electoral Count Commission, but really kind of what happened is Rutherford B. Hayes and Tilden did a deal, and basically Tilden agreed to lose. But the price for letting the Republicans have Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina was that Reconstruction would end. And he knew that the Southern Democrats could then put the South on lockdown, which they did, and it became the Solid South. But those kind of stories, if we study those, we build a perspective on why we're in the situation we are today, and we probably can think more intelligently about it. So for a historian, that was pretty short. So I'll wrap up with that.
Thank you, David. And no, it wasn't short, but thank you. I've always found that students think that constitutional law and constitutional rights is a very academic discussion. And the one time it ceases to be an academic discussion is when it's 11 o'clock at night and you see blue lights behind you and you're pulled over for a burned out taillight. That's why I think Professor Walton Neely, I think, is going to have a good contribution here in terms of criminal justice. That's where the Constitution really meets the road. And that's where most of us are going to feel the consequences of the Constitution. Professor Walton Neely?
Yes, I think as far as the Constitution is concerned, just like we reform criminal laws, and I know David said that it's been amended 27 times, but until we resolve the fact that certain people and certain entities have too much power and no accountability, giving each citizen's full protection up under the Constitution, just looking at fundamental government, I think that we're gonna always be, have this gridlock when trying to fix or change or amend anything. It is more of a social crisis than anything. I believe that one of the main issues is that states have too much, the states have their own monetary system, so I don't even know where to begin.
Well, we've got some really good questions already starting. Let me leave a little bit of time for our student panelists to be able to contribute here. Micah?
Hi, my name is Micah, of course. I'm the 2020 through 2021 SGA President. And honestly, I'm here to just learn more about this topic and just get a better understanding of it. I wouldn't say I'm too big into politics, but I know it's very beneficial because I live in a world that's based off of it. So I'm just trying to get as much that's beneficial in my education on the topic as possible. But I believe it's very important that as a student and also as a professor, and everyone should like just go out and vote and make some changes.
Thank you. And Nearly? Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if I'm not.
Hi, my name is Natalie Mejia, and I'm TCC SGA's treasurer for this school year. My input on this topic is when it comes to the Constitution, I don't believe that it needs to be removed, but I do believe that it needs to be updated. For an example, like with everything that's going on right now, I feel like it's not being enforced, like the amendment as it was mentioned earlier. Like, I feel like people are out there protesting and they're not really being allowed to peacefully protest and stuff like that. And I also believe that, like Micah said, I don't really know much about politics and stuff, but I'm here to learn and grow, of course. So that's my input on it. I believe that it should be updated, or like it should be more enforced where people are able to freely, do what they have to do, go protest or vote and all that stuff. And there shouldn't be like any restrictions put into place to like revoke that right that citizens have.
Thank you. Thank you. Our first comment, and I think I've lost it, but it was up first in terms of the question and answer. And I swear this came in. This is not me saying this. As some of you know, it's kind of my perspective. Is the Constitution outdated? Does it need to just be flat out replaced? And again, that wasn't me saying it. It was an anonymous contributor. But as you know, as some of you know, sometimes I've said that we're using a 233-year-old set of directions to try to build something. And perhaps we should just trash the whole thing. Any of you?
I'll jump in there. No, I wouldn't trash the whole thing. I think seeing modest changes to the Constitution. So we were talking about how, the right to protest and peacefully protest. Nearly brought that up, and she's right. And that is a protection in the Constitution. Again, it's not the Constitution needs to be updated. It already protects that. It's whether or not we follow and enforce the Constitution. I don't know what it already guarantees to us: freedoms of speech and press and religion and assembly and protest. We just have to make certain that, the words are followed. And I realize that's easier to say than to do, but, the words are already there to protect that. Again, it's not the Constitution's fault. It's our failure to abide by it.
And Grant, I think you wanted to address that as well, did you not?
That was more of me saying that somebody on the panel would address that.
Okay.
Oh, can I chime in?
Certainly.
I go with Steve Powers there. Historically, many countries have tried constitutions. France, I think, is on their fifth one now. The problem is the Constitution still has this sort of aura of reverence that people have. I think if you go to try to do a new one, you're just going to devolve into total conflict. And here's the other thing. You can draw up the most beautiful Constitution in the world, but the people have to believe in it, they have to know it, and they have to be willing to support it. My favorite example is Joseph Stalin drew up just a wonderful one that if you go read the Soviet Constitution under Stalin, it's just terrific. There's women's rights, there's everything you could want. Of course, it was just an absolute 1984, totalitarian dictatorship. So because the society was authoritarian, it was worshiping a leader. It wasn't about a constitution. So Stalin loved to pull it out and show, Western leaders or whatever. So, and France has had 5 of them. I think that we ought to, for stability, keep the old Constitution. 1, it's a connection to our whole past. 2, you're never going to have a perfect one. You're better off, I think, creating changes as your society evolves and grows. And third, I just don't think we've got it in us right now. I don't think the American public, I think there's too many people that don't know anything, and then the ones that do can be very polarized. And if you actually tried to have a constitutional convention, I think it would be a disaster. So while we have this reverence for the one we have, let's keep it, but add amendments, because the 27 have done a lot of good. I mean, there's women's voting, there's, the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, and 15, providing a basis for African-American freedom. And just like those, the society has to be willing to support it and carry it out and believe in it. You can look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and they're great. But then you look at what happened after Reconstruction with segregation and Jim Crow and lynchings and things like that, because the people themselves weren't willing to take those things and make them real. And that means court cases, it means dogged, opposition when it's being violated and so on. So I think it'd be too chaotic to try to do a new constitution. Keep the one you have. It's such a great historical monument too. I love things that are old. So we want to keep it and reform it. I think you'd be better off. It's sort of like changing football coaches. FSU had Bobby Bowden for all those years, and everything's totally stabilized. Once you start firing them, then it's so easy. You just get one after another after another. That's like France. They're on number 5. So, no, I don't think you ever want to get rid of it. It'd be like getting rid of Bobby Bowden. It's just not going to end well.
Well, can I say something? I'm sorry, Rick.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say, I mean, I agree with much of what you just said, and you too, Stephen. I think that, there's a lot. I look at the country and say, well, what would you get rid of, right? And this is where it gets tricky, right? I mean, You just look at each amendment, look at the article, and what would you change? Would it look dramatically similar to the one that we currently have? And I think it probably would. My question is simply, what I've been thinking about a lot is, I mean, can the country, are we just trying to apply, how do I say this? Are we still really a country? I mean, do we have so many divergent viewpoints that are predicated on geography, urban, rural? I don't know, I'm looking at this election and it looks like, at least maybe I'm wrong, but a good chunk of the country over, maybe 20, 30% over here and 20, 30% over there, if not more, look at this as a totally existential election. That not only is the election going to be consequential, but that basically life as they know it will end if the other person wins. And I don't think I'm going out on a limb to say that, and that's not a healthy place to be at. I don't know if that has anything to do with the Constitution. And I guess I agree with what you were saying, Stephen, about it being a social crisis, but I also don't think it's totally absent of the Constitution either, in the sense that, again, you have the Electoral College, you have, outside of the Constitution, you have gerrymandering, you have all these things where I think people have lost faith in the ability of the system to bring about the change that they want. Whether now, and there's disagreements about what that change should be, but, when you have situations where you have districts like the one that I'm sitting in right now that starts around Panama City and weaves in and out of neighborhoods all the way through to Ocala, because they want to make sure that there's a particular result. And I understand that these exist by both parties all over the country, although I think one side perhaps does it more than the other, but they're both, no one has clean hands in this, I will say for sure. And, I think that's where you end up with a lot of this. So, some of it is cultural, some of it's media. We don't talk to one another. We don't eat at the same restaurants. We don't wear the same clothes. We don't listen to the same music. We don't watch the same movies or television anymore. There's just not as much commonality. I don't know how to put that back together, but I know that, it's easy to look at it and say it's red state, blue state. I reject that entirely, because I as a former resident of California, there's some parts of California that look just like rural Alabama. And there's some parts of Alabama that are relatively progressive, right? I mean, it just depends if you're in the city. Cities are pretty similar. I don't know if, certainly if like Dallas is really that different than Miami or New York in a lot of ways anymore. And I don't know if rural communities in Florida are different than the ones in California, Oregon, or New York for that matter, you know? So I don't know how you piece that together. I'm much better at finding problems than I am finding solutions, unfortunately. But anyway.
Well, I've got another question, and it goes much to the heart of what both you and Steve and Ms. Powers has raised. And I'll phrase this. Let's say that we do have a social crisis and not a constitutional crisis. Is there a way we could avoid the type of social crisis we are in by amending the Constitution?
I had a thought that occurred to me, which is that, and this goes to what some of the panelists have talked about, I think both David and Stephen, which is that the problem is one of enforcement. Is we have these words that are written in the Constitution. We might want to pass legislation to back up the Constitution. Specifically, I'm sort of grabbing something out of the air, but the emoluments clause. So the emoluments clause is very vague. So why not put some teeth into it and say, this is the emoluments clause. No one who holds public office can, own businesses and make money from the government and get really into the laws. I mean, we have a sort of fine-grained tax laws where we go in and we try to micromanage a little bit. Maybe that's the American people will reject that. Maybe there are some problems with it, but it's just go in and maybe put some teeth onto the Constitution. We say that the president is the one who is the commander in chief, and the Congress declares war, but that's not happening, right? Now, we tried to put some teeth on it with the War Powers Act in 1973, and it was a disaster. So, maybe this is just one more pipe dream that we need to pass legislation to back up the Constitution, because we haven't been very good at it in the past. So just some thoughts.
But you use the example of emoluments clause, but for 233 years, it's never been an issue up until now.
Yeah, that's true. I can't think of anything parallel, of this scale, in the past. I'm trying to think of it, but.
Can you explain the emoluments clause for those who don't know anything about it?
Oh, Rick, you want to do that, or yeah?
I can do it. Or just, anyway.
Brian, one of y'all can do it. Yeah,
that's fine.
Go ahead.
You brought it up, Dugan. Why don't you explain it?
I actually should have studied it a little bit closely before I read it, but it's been a while since I've actually looked at the text of it. But basically it is that you can't receive any money from, in particular, foreign countries is extremely problematic. And you notice in the Federalist Papers, there was a lot of discussion about their fears of, and the writings, that the fear of bribery coming from foreign countries to control politicians. And so the emoluments clause and making money from public office. But it really is vague as the Constitution. And so I don't think we have any teeth on it.
Well, and this is a question that is extraordinarily relevant now. Many of you mentioned the problems with the Electoral College, and this is from Allison Grove. Many of you mentioned the problems with the Electoral College. Do you see an amendment passing to change our presidential election system in your lifetime? If yes, what do you think is the most likely way the amendment will pass, i.e. through the convention process or through a vote in Congress? Good question.
It depends how long my lifetime is.
That's another good question. But
can I address that one, Rick? Is that okay? Actually, we don't have to amend the Constitution to change how the Electoral College works. There's a movement taking place right now. See, states are free under the Constitution to decide how to cast their Electoral College votes. What states have adopted up until now is a method. It's called winner take all. Whichever candidate for president wins more popular votes in a state, they get all of that state's electoral college votes in the electoral college. If we change that, if each state agreed to cast all their electoral college votes for the candidate who won the most votes nationwide, the most popular votes nationwide, which states are free to do, then that would guarantee that each election cycle, whoever won the nationwide popular vote would win the vote in the electoral college. That is the easiest way to do it. So what you've got to do is go state by state and get states to sign on to this. I think, and I don't have the data in front of me, but I think 13 states have signed up already. It doesn't amount to 270 electoral college votes, which is the threshold you need to cross to win the presidency. But I think amending the Constitution, even if we kind of all agree the Electoral College needs to be changed, would be exceedingly difficult. I think this is a great way to kind of do an end around, accomplish the same goal. So I would encourage everybody to look that up, to look up this movement and to encourage your state government to sign on to it. That would be the quickest and the easiest way to ensure that no candidate would win the most votes nationwide but lose in the Electoral College.
Well stated, and a good example, Professor Powers. However, why are we doing an end around to amend the Constitution? Is that the basic mechanics of the Constitution that has now failed? If we can't, and I think it is almost impossible to amend the Constitution. And the Electoral College is a pretty flagrant example of where it's needed. But if we can't amend this, doesn't that create a fundamental flaw within our Constitution today?
Well, the Constitution, to amend it, requires an extraordinary majority, and I think that's a good idea, not a bad one. I don't think a simple majority to change the Constitution would be wise. We'd have hundreds of amendments at some point, and the Constitution would become unworkable. So, is it hard to amend the Constitution? Yes, but I think that's one of the Constitution's strengths. Look, unless an extraordinary majority of Americans are willing to change the Constitution, it shouldn't be changed. So I actually view the amendment process as being a strength. And again, I'll go back to this. I hate to be a one-trick pony, but it's a social crisis. We had no problem changing the Constitution decades ago in fundamental and important ways. Why is it in just this age that we seem to be paralyzed and unable to do anything until we can agree to get along and reach some consensus on some basic values? We're not going to be able to change the Constitution. We're not even going to be able to pass simple legislation in Congress. I think it's more about the fabric of America and changing that first, right?
Steve, you make a good point. You don't want it to look like the Florida Constitution,
right?
With things like pregnant pig amendments and everything else. So you made a good point there. It could get unworkable if it was too easy.
Good.
So even the Florida Constitution requires 60%. Yeah. It's not a simple majority.
Right.
Like passing initiatives in places like California.
Laura Waitley asks a very, very specific question. I think a good one. How do you think Maine's ranked choice voting is constitutional?
Yeah, good question.
So for those who don't know what that is, that's, if I understand it correctly, the idea that you rank, you vote for your candidate, and then you basically list your second choices, your third choice, and different elections will have different thresholds as to how many you get to vote on. I know I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We had that for our citywide elections, and you would list for the city council, I think your like top 10 people you would bubble in order. And then if it's not your first, then it goes to your second, it goes to your third. So that way you don't always have to right off the bat make a compromises to your first or second choices. How is that constitutional? I don't know if it is. I don't know if it isn't. That's a good question. What do you all think about that?
I'm trying to remember. I don't have the Constitution in front of me, but I don't think there's that much detail regarding how states select their.
I mean,
I agree. If that's what we're talking about, obviously, if they want to use ranked choice voting at the state and local level, that's completely constitutional. They can use whatever they want. They have to be a republic under the Constitution, and this would be a form of a republic. So, but in terms of electing members to the U.S. Congress, David, you got the Constitution right in front of you. I don't know that it requires a specific procedure that has to be.
I think the Constitution
has to have a Republican format. I just know that.
Right.
It's pretty vague on it.
I think it leaves it in the state's hands, and I think that's
It really does,
if it's able to do this, that it's a state domain issue as per Amendment 10.
Yeah, how they select their electors is really up to the state.
Yeah.
I don't see why ranked choice I don't think it wouldn't be constitutional, because again, that broad state power to do it to elect like you want. I mean, the state legislatures in 1868 election, the Florida legislature just voted itself to award Ulysses Grant our 3 electoral votes without even running a presidential election. They said it was too chaotic, because of Reconstruction. So they didn't even have a presidential vote. They just voted. The legislature just said, we're going to give them to Grant. So I don't see why ranked choice wouldn't. I mean, the legislators used to pick the senators, and I think the states have pretty broad, Rick, I'm with you. I think the states have pretty broad authority to determine how they pick their slate.
I've got a rather philosophical question from Gabrielle Convery, and I'm quoting her, quoting Gabrielle. Haven't there been other times in history where we have had such a pessimistic view in the upcoming election and feared the world as we know it might end? I agree that it's an extremely important election, but sometimes I feel like we have a very negative view which might limit us from achieving change, and was just curious.
It's a good question.
Probably a good statement as to where we're at now, certainly.
Social media doesn't help.
Yeah, that's.
Oh no, it hurts.
Yeah, that's the difference. That's the difference, is that we live in an age of social media, whereas in the past that didn't exist, and that amplifies the problem.
Well, there's always.
There have been crises in the past which have been pretty bad in terms of, I can think, I mean, there's the obvious one, of course, the pre-Civil War and the Civil War period, but then there's 1968, which was a very tumultuous year. There was an assassination of one of the Democratic primary candidates who looked like he was going to win, Bobby Kennedy, and you had the assassination of Martin Luther King. You had the Vietnam War. And there was just generally an overall feeling that maybe young people were going to overthrow the system and create a revolution. Certainly they did in France. They had a 1968 revolution. There were marches across the world. Even in Tokyo, they had marches, which the Japanese don't do protests necessarily like the West. And so there was something magical happening in 1968. So even in the communist countries, they had rebellions.
Well, you had that new generation coming on after World War II, and they'd grown up so differently. Than World War II was a real marking point. So you just had young people all over the world that had just, to one degree or another, had grown up so differently than their parents. I think that it sparked all that. But oh my gosh, 1860, but
so what I was thinking of. I
mean, the states are, Southerners are resigning out of the military and forming a new army. Well, once they saw that Lincoln was going to win, a lot of people don't realize Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in a lot of Southern states because they claimed he didn't have enough support. So, I mean, it was really a mess. But one of my favorites for today is that 1876 election, because you had, once again, militias were starting to drill, and it was really a deal worked out between Hayes and Tilden, but Tilden had the popular vote. But it was so crazy in the South because the Klan was terrorizing Republicans in Africa, and I think that's so funny. It was the Republicans that were being terrorized by the Klan and the African Americans, and they couldn't get to the polls. And so in the states that had already been readmitted, they just let it go. I mean, and Tilden won those. But in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, which were the last ones under military rule because they were the most misbehaving in terms of violence and lynchings and things, that there, the Republican governors and legislatures, they just basically threw out Democratic votes because they said, well, you're not letting our people vote, so we're not going to let yours vote. And the Democratic Party and the Republican Party each came up with slates of electors. And the Congress had the Electoral Count Act, but it was like deadlocked. And then one guy quit, and they put in Grant put in a Republican, and it passed by one vote. But really, the Wormley Hotel meeting between representatives of Hayes and Tilden, kind of behind the scenes, quietly agreed that, look, we can do this Electoral Count Commission. That's in the record books, and that's what, if you Google it, you find 185 to 184 in the Electoral College with Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes gets Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. But the handshake deal was over plenty of bourbon, cigars, and smoke-filled rooms at the hotel, which ironically was owned by an African-American, if you can believe that. I mean, the biggest sort of selling out of African-American rights took place in that room, in that hotel, because the deal was Tilden agreed to just back down. But Hayes was the Republican, and back then they were the party of civil rights. They were the party of African Americans who voted overwhelmingly Republican. And Hayes said, please, whatever you want, because of these militias that were drilling. And so the deal was Hayes gets those electoral votes, wins at 185 to 184, but Hayes had to promise Reconstruction is totally ended and it is over. And the last federal troops that were doing any occupation duty were removed. And Hayes followed through with the handshake, and he did remove the troops. And that ended Reconstruction, and the Republicans just ran for their lives, after that, because you're conservative Southern Democrats. That's what they called themselves, conservative. They were the white supremacists at the time. And so, those kind of elections, I think it's a good idea to study. And you realize—
Boy, I'm glad that we don't have the problem with militias anymore.
Yeah, yeah, right. But it's a good idea to study those to see that, to keep ourselves in perspective. But Ted, you're right. I mean, there is, I don't think it looks like 1876, but I couldn't say it wouldn't turn into that. Things happen.
Well, we've got a question that kind of falls very well into that. It's well stated. Does hyperpartisan interpretation of the Constitution for party benefit erode trust in the conversation? I think in the Constitution, and I think it is well stated. Do we trust the Constitution less? Because we do have really, really different interpretations sometimes of the Constitution.
Right.
It is sometimes a very, very subjective document.
But one of the reasons I like to keep the Constitution is, so far, both sides love to wrap themselves in the Constitution, if you think about it. You don't have one side yet saying get rid of it. I mean, no, they differ. Like Rick, you said, they interpret it differently, but it's still this kind of sacred thing. Neither side wants to be seen as not supporting the Constitution. In fact, these little things here were handed out by the Tea Party. Okay, so I'm just saying. But both sides seem to like, that's why I want to keep it. Both sides can still say it's a cool thing.
You could argue that in times of crisis, in times of hyperpartisanship and conflict, this is when we need the Constitution more than ever. We have to agree, no matter what our political differences might be, we have to agree on the rules.
Yeah.
Agree, these are the rules under which we're going to disagree, and these are the rules under which we're going to resolve our disagreements. Otherwise, you have anarchy, you have chaos. We end up shooting each other to resolve our differences. So, in a way, I think, the Constitution and the rules embedded within it are even more important during these times of crisis. That's the one thing we've all got to agree on, is the rules we're all going to play by.
Yeah, you got to have that.
Yeah.
Well,
otherwise, it's just my tribe against your tribe.
Right.
And this ties in. It's an anonymous question. It's really, I think, a very poignant question. The questioner says, I know this isn't a constitutionally based question, but then they go on to say, does the power still belong to the people? Which is a remarkably constitutionally based question. That is what the Constitution is all about. Does the power actually still belong to the people? And we're assuming here that it ever did.
Well, if it wasn't the people, then I guess I would have to, I hate doing this, I would have to answer a question with a question. I mean, if it's not the people, then who does it belong to?
I would assume in this case, the question would say an elite class, an autonomous group. And
I think we'd all agree that moneyed interests carry more weight in the system than non-moneyed interests. I certainly believe that. Coming from kind of a pseudo-libertarian point of view, it's one of the reasons why, in any system, the best you can hope for is some autonomy for yourself. There's no guarantee that people are ever going to actually rule. No guarantee.
Yeah.
As to who's actually going to hold power. All you can hope for is to live under a system where whoever does hold that power has limitations on how they can use it. There's limits to how far they can invade and intrude into your life. And we're back to the Constitution then. Regardless of who has power, if we abide by the Constitution, it places well-defined limits on that power. And so again, the rules matter, I think, here.
Yeah.
Well, and the argument that goes along with that is, should the power belong to the people?
Sure.
Do we trust the people significantly enough that they should have significant power?
The answer makes, you may not trust the people, but that doesn't mean they still shouldn't have the power. I mean, people make bad decisions every day. But, again, if not the people, then who? Right?
I just saw a poll yesterday. 80% of the American public has no idea what the Holocaust was. Should these people be making decisions and not have a basic understanding in terms of one of the worst crimes that took place in humanity? How can they go ahead with, if people don't know that, what else do they not know? And perhaps power should not lie in the hands of the people.
So then who would have the power?
A more elite, intelligent class?
I mean, are we going to go back to, Plato's
Republic, man.
Plato's the philosopher king idea? I mean, should we let Mensa rule the country? Like, I don't know. There's a great Simpsons where they did that.
What did Hitler say? What did Hitler say? It is the good fortune of governments the people do not think.
Yeah, it's true.
Perhaps then the power should lie in the hands of the people.
Yeah, I'm going with the Vox Populi, but I wouldn't mind me a Marcus Aurelius right now. But I think on consideration, the trouble is, how do you replace him? He screwed up and put his crazy son in and started the fall of the Roman Empire. So he broke the chain of the good emperors, that they were picking the best guy, and adopting them instead of putting their own kids in, who were usually, dissolute or nuts or whatever. So they'd pick the best guy. And it worked great until he blew it and put Commodus in. So you really, I think you're probably best going with the people.
It might be a good note to end on. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank our participants for wonderful questions, excellent questions. I want to thank all of you. If you enjoy this type of conversation, Dr. Dugan does a political roundtable this time every week, Thursday at 2 o'clock. Dr. Dugan, how do students participate in that?
Well, I've been sending them out to the class, but there's got to be some way that I can do it publicly on a more public for all the classes. I might want to put it on the TCC Facebook page, or there's the Tally Profs. We
have a group. We have a Facebook group.
We do have a Facebook group, but it's not as accessible as I would like it to be.
I think if you search the TCC Political Roundtable, it will come up, if I understand it correctly. And then you
is there any way, and I don't mean to add on to your workload, we were all talking about this before the panel started about, how much busier we all are right now. Is there any way you could send me the Zoom link?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Email, and so I could give it to my classes. And
oh yeah,
I think I sent it out earlier in the semester, but I'll
go back and look.